Yeah, if you don't know me, I am one of two Pastor Jesses that we have here at Northview. One's in Mission, one's in Abbotsford, and I have the pleasure of serving here in Abbotsford. So welcome here. We're going to continue our ReBuild series, and let's do this together. Let's go to the Old Testament book of Nehemiah, a short little book tucked away in the Old Testament. We're going to look at chapters 1 through 4 as we continue this series, partly because the story we are looking at has been considered, and really is, the greatest volunteer project in the Bible, which not so coincidentally happens to fall on our Serve weekend together. And while we're looking at the story and as we kind of dive into it, I was reminded of something that I'm pretty sure most of us, if you're like me, just really have a semi-large dislike for, and that is this thing called group projects. Now, most of us would have had one, maybe or two in high school, maybe more so in our college years than we have if we've kind of grown up and kind of gotten further along. Thinking about this message, I was kind of refreshed to remember one in college that did not go so well and fuels this dislike that I have. So it was my first year, one of the first classes that I ever had, and there was a group project that represented a fairly sizable percentage of the grade for that course. So to my horror, as I look at the syllabus the first day, group project, great, that's not going to be good. Further adding to the displeasure was that these groups are going to be assigned at random. So if I happen to know somebody who seemed to care about grades as much as I did, or I trusted kind of, their academic ability, no, that's not on the table. It's going to be all random. So myself and three others would get assigned to this thing, and there's two parts. One was a paper. The other was a presentation. And as we met the first time to discuss, which took a while to actually meet, because again, people in their first year of college aren't super organized, we met, discussed, and how it happened was I was going to take the paper, and the other three were going to take the presentation. And that division of labor seemed a little bit suspicious, but I was okay because I liked the fact that at least half of this was in my control. My grades were in my hands. To further add to the displeasure, though, the presentation part was in front of the president of the school. So you got to picture all these like first year college kids, 18, maybe 19 years old. We're going to go see the president, and we're going to bring this presentation, like one of the first things we've ever done, to him. So I've got the paper locked in, I'm good with that, but I come along because I'm part of the group, and I watch them kind of enter nervously into the president's office. Here we presented the three, and they're going for it, and they kind of get to this moment, and they stop, and the president says these three words: "Is that all?" Now, two things really rattled me when I heard him say, "Is that all?" The first of which was his tone of voice was not condemning or accusatory or demeaning in any way. It was actually worse. It was like hopefully optimistic, like as if he was trying to encourage the three that were up there doing their part of the assignment, that, maybe you're just a little tongue-tied or a little bit nervous. Like, is that all? Like, they keep going, like there must be more. So that part rattled me. What also rattled me was I made eye contact with one of those other three, and what their eyes communicated to me was, yeah, that was actually all. That was all that we had. So for 1, 2, 3 painstaking seconds, there is nothing but silence in the president's office. Except I think in my head I was hearing the sound of my grades falling, like just going down. And I thought the only thing I could do was like in a sitcom or something, like the frame is there, and like I pop in, "No, that's not all there is, actually." Kind of was like, "But wait, there's more." And so I just kind of clumsily kind of put together whatever else was in the top of my head from the paper, threw it in there, and that was kind of the project. And I left there feeling and reminded of the feeling of when we're presented with something big, like a group project, or perhaps even something as sizable as the mission of the church, and knowing that there's going to be a whole variety of things to do and a whole amount of things that are going to feel sometimes like uncomfortable. Maybe we have this hesitation that like, do I really want to enter in? Or this expectation of, if I step into this, that's going to be met with some sort of feeling of discomfort or frustration, maybe even disappointment. However, this series, ReBuild, is about shaking us awake to the realities of the time in which we live. And more than that, to renew our sense of wonder and our sense of expectation for what God might want to do in us and through us. So is there something then from our study of these Old Testament books, Ezra, Nehemiah, and a few others, there's something today specifically from Nehemiah 1 through 4, this great volunteer project, rebuilding a wall, that as we look at God's people in God's place, being aware of God's promises in their part of the story back then, are there things that we can draw forward to our time as God's people in our part of the story so that we can enter in and engage? And I hope that we can leave here today, all of us, with this sense, this feeling of, let's be all in, all together. Let's be all in, all together. And I'm going to describe a little bit of what does all in, all together mean by framing it under three things I think we need that we see in this narrative from the Old Testament story of Nehemiah. Let's be all in, all together. I think we're going to need three things, and the first of which is this. We are going to need a compelling vision of God. For us to be entering in and experiencing all of what God might want to do in us, through us, amidst the realities of the story that we live in as God's people, we're going to need a compelling vision of God. And this is what Nehemiah has. He is the cupbearer to a foreign king. He hasn't, like some of the others in his nation of Israel, he has not yet returned home. And he gets this report within that context, away from home. And we see this at the start of the story in Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 3. He gets this report from those about the city of God. They said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are destroyed by fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. This is some point in the mid-400s BC. Commentators say possibly about 2 miles of wall are in disrepair and in ruin, probably neglected for somewhere around 100 to 150 years. And for Nehemiah, if the wall is in ruin, this represents a disrespect for God himself. It's God's city, where God's temple, God's presence are to dwell. It does not look good to have the city in this state. And so his reaction is because of the simple truth that Nehemiah cares about what God cares about. I think it's because he has a compelling vision of who his God is. If you look at verse 4 of Nehemiah 1, it says, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. To care about what God cares about, you have to know the character of God. And this is what we see bound up in Nehemiah's prayer. The great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love. He knows his character, but more than his character, he knows God's word and God's activity. If we skip ahead to verse 8 of Nehemiah 1, in this prayer, remember, Lord, remember the word you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you're unfaithful, I'll scatter you among the peoples. That happened. Verse 9, but if you return to me, keep my commandments and do them. Though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them, bring them to the place that I've chosen to make my name dwell there. They are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. So Nehemiah cares about what God cares about because he knows God's character, he knows what God has said, and he also knows what God has done. He's aware of what the story ought to be, and it's like his life revolves around who his God is and what his God is up to. The story is that the three-in-one God is the creator of all things. The story is that humanity rebelled and unleashed sin and death into the world. The story is that God promised to bring a solution for this. He chose a people to bless the whole world through. These people were unfaithful. They rebelled. Yeah, they did. And God exiled them to a foreign land, but now they're starting to come back. And there are promises yet unfulfilled, promises for a future, for a hope, for this place, Jerusalem, with this city, with this wall that's supposed to not be in this state, where God's going to launch his kingdom project to make things happen on earth as in heaven, launching from that place. There's a gap between what Nehemiah knows the story ought to be and what the story actually is, and this is his reaction to it. One more piece of this part of the story. This is what happens. So he goes to the king. This is King Artaxerxes in Susa, one of the key cities in Persia. And the king says to him in chapter 2, verse 2, "Why is your face sad? Seeing you're not sick. This is nothing but sadness of the heart." So he identifies there's something going on in Nehemiah's heart. Nehemiah says, "Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, 'Let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad? When the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire.' Then the king said to me, 'What are you requesting?' So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, 'If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it.'" Nehemiah has a compelling vision of who his God is and what his God cares about. And all of his choices from that point are a reflex to that vision, to that awareness of his character, of his word, of his activity, of what the story ought to be. And I wonder for us in the time in which we live, in the part of the story that we live as New Testament disciples, what type of choices, what type of decisions, what type of reflex reactions do we have to the needs of our time? And what are they informed by? Do we have the same type of reflex that Nehemiah has to go, like, I see what the story ought to be. I'm aware of what God's promises are and what the story should be heading towards. And I need to engage. I need to go to God with this and step and enter in. Do we have that type of reflex that would translate to some sort of caring for what God cares about? A care that might say, yeah, sign me up for one of those 316 slots. Yeah, sign me up to serve. Yeah, I want to give some of my hard-earned finances to the mission of God. Yeah, I want to enter in. I want to be all in. Do we have that type of care for the things of God? So here's my problem, though. When I'm kind of presented with the idea of caring more about what God cares about, I run into two barriers to kind of stepping in. And maybe they're barriers that if you're like me, you'd identify as well. And there's kind of two categories of them. The first is, I'm too busy. And the second is, I'm too burdened. Both of these things are barriers to me, wanting to care more or engage more or step in more than I already am. And I wonder if that's some of us here too. In fact, I know it actually is. Like, you just think about the time in which we live in. You're sitting here listening to a sermon, probably not the first sermon you've heard this month, maybe this year, safe to say, with all of its questions and thought-provoking ideas and application points, action steps. There are lots of things you're kind of instructed and feel propelled to do week to week. You live in this kind of digital age with all of its distractions and things that are vying for your attention. We're perhaps the most distracted and divided kind of generation ever, perhaps, because of all these things pulling at us. But more than that, more than just feeling like, oh yeah, we're busy. I know some of your stories, not all of them, but I also know that for so many of us, it's not just that we feel busy, it's that we actually are burdened. Not just financially, perhaps, but also with things in our health. Things that you're kind of trial and error trying to figure out in some sort of medical situation you're facing. Or maybe some sort of relational strain. Or maybe it's not those things. Maybe it actually is, Jesse, that first one you said, that's the financial one. Like, some of us might have seen the report from Food Banks Canada that ranked the province in which we live just these past few weeks a near failing D+ grade for poverty reduction efforts. So be it housing or food security or something like that, nearly 50% of the people in that particular survey saying, look, this year, 2024, we are worse off than we were last year. And between being busy with all these different things and between feeling burdened for whatever reason we have, now we're hearing this idea of this call to be a bit more all in. to care a bit more about the things of God. I spoke with a guy a few years ago who his burden was that he was hospitalized for a period of time. And upon making it through to some degree, so he didn't have to actually be in a hospital bed anymore, returns to church. This is a different city, different context. But on one of those first moments back in church, he sees a guy like me up on a stage, opening up the Word of God, calling his people, calling their church to engage in what? To engage in serving. And the way my friend put it to me was, as he was sitting there, one of the very first times he's back in church, he's going, like, his reaction in his heart is like, dude, I barely got here today. I'm like hanging on by a thread, and you want me to do what? I'm busy, I'm burdened. So wherever you are, is there something in this call for you? Wherever you lie on the spectrum, is there something here to respond with? And if it is, it's not going to be through shame. It's not going to be through guilt. It's not going to be just kind of cruising through feeling that, no, I'm doing good enough. I'm kind of on cruise control. I feel like the response I have is adequate. I think it is going to be like Nehemiah, through a renewed passion to consider just how much our lives revolve around God. See, Nehemiah's passion is for God's kingdom, God's glory, and the city that God loves. And all of this passion, it motivates him to risk a lot of different things. Risk his relationship with this king, this foreign king. Risk being rejected by him. It motivates him to leave a prestigious position in that royal setting. It motivates him to face the large task of rebuilding what is ruined in the face of opposition. And as I was looking at his response and how just, this reflex reaction he has, I wonder what Nehemiah had imagined his life to be before he received the news, the report of how the wall of Jerusalem was. Because I think if I were him, I might have had certain temptations to say, oh, the wall, like it's ruined? Well, that's unfortunate. But this cupbearing career I have, it's kind of taken off, and it's a pretty important position with the king. I kind of just want to see where this goes for a few more years, or maybe it would have been like, hey, I'm pretty sure Zerubbabel and Ezra and some of these other guys, I'm pretty sure they went ahead of me. They must be on it. Like somebody else will handle that. That's totally fine. But that's not his response. His vision of God is so compelling. He's wholeheartedly in. He's wholeheartedly prioritizing. He's wholeheartedly sacrificing. And I think it's because his life revolves around who his God is. So this challenges me to think about, well, how do I organize my life? How do you organize your life? If you think about your calendar, how you've arranged it. Because I think the degree to which something is important to us influences our activity. To the point where when something is important enough, we don't even interpret it as an inconvenience or an interruption to our lives. So, a grandparent calls you up, says, hey, we booked this really nice trip somewhere warmer than Abbotsford, even in May. Yes, there's no rain there. You're moving your calendar around. You're shifting some things around. It's not an inconvenience. It's like, well, that sounds like an important thing to do. You're sitting at your desk and your spouse rolls up to the parking lot in middle of the workday, kind of that 2 p.m. slot where you just need some sort of renewal and revival in your life, and then the text pops up on your phone, hey, I brought you a pour over from your favorite place. You're stepping away from the desk. It's not like, that's an interruption. I'm not going to, no, like you're going. That's important enough for you to engage. Or maybe a friend calls you up with really good seats to the hockey game, and it's like, well, you know what? I had other plans this evening, but this isn't actually, you don't have these plans right now, I realize, in Abbotsford. But in any case, you get the idea. It wouldn't be that big of an inconvenience or an interruption. It would be important enough for you to move things around, which makes me wonder, how important are the things of God for us? So that if we are even busy, even burdened, we're looking at this going, you know what? I'm not even going to interpret this as an inconvenience or an interruption because of how important this is to God. I want to care about what God cares about. I think this is so key because if we miss the thing, if we miss caring about what God cares about, then at best this sermon could be misinterpreted as a sales pitch to volunteer at a nonprofit. Because our problem, it's not, we need to build a wall or build a building even, it's that people need to be built. People do not know God as well as they could. the people that you know. They're more spiritually asleep or more spiritually dead than they ought to be. This is the need. This is why we have all these things. Every role that we have, all 316 plus of those things, are meant to facilitate some sort of way for people to move along, to encounter the same living God of Nehemiah, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love. It's this God, as we've sung about, who's with us, this God who is for us. And if it's not about this, then I don't think you should care about any of this. I don't think I should either. But because it is, I think we ought to. So a starting point for me is to ask myself the question, well, what would happen if I welcomed God's interruptions in my life? What would happen? What could he do with that? And do I have a compelling enough vision of his character, his word, his activity, and the place I sit in his story to go, you know what, if something comes along that he puts in front of me, that's going to be important enough that it's not even going to register for me as an inconvenience or an interruption, but an opportunity to step in. So let's be all in, all together, because we care about what God cares about. We're going to need a compelling vision of God, but also, the need is big enough for the involvement of anyone and everyone. So what we're also going to need is a collective effort from the people of God. If you look at Nehemiah chapter 2, you're gonna see how the people engage. He comes to them and then it says they strengthen their hands for the work. Like, let us rise up and build. He calls them to this. After he gets there, he assesses the situation, says they strengthen their hands for the good work in Nehemiah chapter 2:18. They strengthen their hands. And then you get to chapter 3, and we're not going to spend a ton of time here, but there's this whole stack of things where it's like, okay, look, next to this person was this person. They all start to engage. They've got this section, these gates, those parts of the wall. In these 30 plus verses, we have like 40 people listed and 17 different groups of people and all these sorts of different careers listed where the people step in and they engage in the work because of the need that is before them. The need's big enough for the involvement of anyone and everyone. And if we're going to move with this compelling vision of God, we're also going to need a collective effort of the people, because none of us, like Nehemiah, can do what we are called to do on our own. It's too big for any one of us. The task is huge. And so you see this in chapter 3. Next to this person was this person from this group. Next to this person was this person from this group, from all sectors, locations, repairing and rebuilding. And that's kind of what we see here at Northview as well. If you look around the banners, if you look around even the different pictures of people, next to the tech workers are the kids workers. Next to the community group leaders, we've got the hospitality team. Next to the Bible study table leaders, we've got people in seniors and care and so on and so forth. Next to this group, we have this group. Next to that group, we have that group. All of these different things, all of these different programs, sharing life in community, hosting weekend services, planting churches, sending missionaries, all to help people become deeply rooted followers of Jesus and help us see our vision of having a gospel-centered church within reach of every Canadian. The task is huge, and it ought to involve all of us. So what's more than this, than just the task size? Why we also need a collective effort of the people is because the opposition is real. So we move through chapter 2, chapter 3, get to the start of chapter 4 in Nehemiah, and we read this in verse 1. When Sanballat, one of the characters introduced in chapter 2, heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates in the army of Samaria, he said, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What they are building, even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones." So just because the people engage, just because Nehemiah has this compelling vision, just because the people gather together for this collective effort, doesn't mean there won't be opposition. Doesn't mean it's just going to be smooth sailing. And for us too, there's going to be opposition. And I wonder what opposition we're already feeling I've heard maybe this term deconstruction, terms like progressive theology. Maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's apathy, maybe it's, friends of yours, the local news kind of roasting a big church for wanting to get bigger. Well, I don't know what type of things there are, but you also know on top of this, there's going to be spiritual warfare and the opposition that comes from that. Or even in my ministry, in community groups, it's like, look, we've got opposition that's like stuff that's out of our control, like socioeconomic things. Like, well, we know we need more community groups. We know we want to have more people sharing life, seeking God's presence together and being connected in that way. But it's like, look, the generation behind us, based on just where we live, it's like, look, hey, Jesse, I would love to start a community group, like this conversation I had recently sitting in this couple's home. But it's like, look, you see, like we have space for you and this cat, and that is it. I'm like, well, get rid of the cat. Like, what's the problem? But like, that's just kind of the place we find ourselves in. And even in the digital age, it's like, how do we even do eye contact? How do we even do all this sort of stuff? There's opposition to the task, and it's not even necessarily stuff we might obviously point to. So what's the response? And what's the response that they had to not only the size of the task, these miles and miles of wall, but the opposition that they face? Nehemiah 4:4. He prays, "Hear, O God, for we're despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. Do not cover their guilt. Let not their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders." So we built the wall, and the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. So that first bit, like we live in a different part of the gospel story, so prayers like this, the imprecatory prayers, we engage with those differently, which we're not going to get into right now. But what I want us to see is verse 6. They had a mind to work. Literally the word there is they had a heart to work. Their hearts were set on this. And then the Old Testament idea of the heart, this is like the command center of a person. Their mind, their will, their emotions, they're pointed in this direction, which gets me to ask myself, again, okay, if the command center of my life, where is it? What's it pointed towards? Is it calibrated to be all in, all together with you for the work that's in front of us? Like in most churches, analysts say that 80% of the work is done by 20% of the people. But as I'm reading this, I'm like, well, it sure seems like 100% of the work is done by 100% of the people. What would it be like to be in a church like that? This is a call not just to have a compelling vision of God, but to have a collective effort from the people of God, a collective seriousness to engage the opportunity before us. So yes, let's be all in caring about what God cares about, but let's be all in all together by doing our part alongside everyone else. Oh, and our part may not be glamorous. It may not feel like an exact perfect fit all the time. You read through some of chapter 3 and you see they've got like goldsmiths and perfumers, and like it would have been easy for them to be like, dude, I know nothing about building a wall. I'm like just kind of over here mixing my stuff. Like, how am I going to engage? But they do their part. Now, I'm a bit of a movie guy, and so I wanted to put before you 3 heroes that you probably have never heard of. Harry Harrison, funny name, Ray Garcia, David Nichols. Anyone? Any of your personal heroes? Probably not. Because the movies that they helped with, Return of the King, Star Wars, Inception, the role that they played was the role of the key grip. Wow, does that sound glamorous? Like some specialized equipment supervisor who kind of helps the production succeed, helps to bring the director's vision to life. We should be deeply thankful for these people if we love those movies. The problem is like, does anybody know them? Does anybody know us in the various places that we're serving? Because see, when you preach a message like this, you know there are people who are already engaged going like, yeah, I'm doing my part. Nobody may know I'm doing it. I'm filling the communion cups. I'm doing whatever it is. Our part may not be glamorous. But just like the key grips in these movies, their part isn't to be the star. Their part is to make the star shine. And so too with us, with any role that we could step in and engage. Famous British preacher Martin Lloyd-Jones once wrote of revival, the need of the hour, individually and collectively, is the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. So we're all trying to make this star shine. That's the part of the story that we are in right now. It's not about a wall. It's about building people to help them see who Jesus really is. So again, I ask, what do we do with this? What is my next step even? I feel like as somebody who's on staff, I'm about as in as it feels like I should be. I'm a pastor here. Is there something for me even in this message? Because I'm looking through this last week going if there's not something even for me, if my heart isn't grabbed, how could your hearts be even grabbed? And so this is where this last piece that maybe I feel the most conviction around. And I wonder if it's where you might be too. Because we need a compelling vision of God. We need a collective effort from the people of God. But thirdly, what we also need is a conviction about the Spirit of God. A conviction that he responds to our prayer, a conviction that we need to not just appreciate how that God is with us and for us, but actually be desperate for him to do the things that we simply cannot hope to do. It's been widely attested throughout history that prayer is always the catalyst for the renewal work of God. And most who have lived through the stages of revival, as Pastor Mark quoted Tim Keller last week, these stages, stage 1 of sleepy Christians waking up, stage 2 of nominal Christians getting saved, stage 3, the lost being reached, stage 4, the nation being transformed. If that is what revival is about, there is always a move of prayer because of a conviction about the Spirit of God. And if that's true, that's what we should see in our study of these Old Testament books in these weeks. And guess what? It's exactly what we do see. If we were to take a bit more time and read through these chapters a bit more slowly, we would catch this. But just a few verses that we maybe already did hit on, but maybe wasn't super obvious. 1 verse 4, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept, mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Chapter 2, verse 4, he has this conversation with the king. What are you requesting? The fastest, in the moment, on the spot, on the go prayer in the Bible. So I prayed to the God of heaven. And then he responds with his request. Chapter 4, verse 4, hear, O God, we are despised. Chapter 4, verse 9, when they're kind of facing this opposition, they know the big effort of the people is going to come against, the opposing forces. They're plotting to come against them, fight against them, cause confusion. Verse 9 of chapter 4, and we prayed to our God and set a guard as a protection against them day and night. Oh yeah, like manpower is needed. We got to do something, but manpower has a limit. But God's power in the story cannot be missed because it has no limit. It's what drives the whole narrative along. I think this is a call to be praying people, coming out of a conviction about the Spirit of God and how he works, that prayer does something, that as we pray, God does work. It's prayer that creates this renewal desire. It's prayer that sustains this renewal desire, even in facing the size of the project or the opposition that comes along with the project. It's prayer that enables perseverance and hopefully accomplishment. Because if we skip ahead to chapter 6 of Nehemiah, this is what we read in verse 15 and 16. So the wall was finished on the 55th day of the month Elul in 52 days. A sizable project with all of its opposition and non-expert workforce coming together. And verse 16, when all our enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem. For what? They perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. I'm raising my kids at Northview. What I want them to see is that all of what we do here, it's not just the product of having, significant financial resource, gifted individuals, an impressive facility. I want them to see that all the stuff that is attached that's deeply meaningful and impactful comes about because of the work of God himself. We're having baptisms in a few weeks, and if all that what people see is wow, it seems like the service was so polished, it seems like, they've got a great facility, they got a nice baptism tank, it seemed very orderly and all that sort of stuff. Yes, good, we stewarded our time and our talent and our treasure well, but more than that, what happened was as these people went in, it was because the Spirit of God drew them, saved them, brought them from death to life in the first place. We need a conviction about the Spirit of God so that it's not just us stewarding our time, talent, and treasure. It's doing those things with a desperation through prayer. like these people in this Old Testament narrative, so that when people see the work, it's like, wow, that work that Northview did, it had been accomplished with the help of their God. So if you're like me, maybe a starting point is to ask, well, what would happen if I got desperate about history shaping prayer? I think what I see in this story is a call to contend. Mark Sayers, in his book, Reappearing Church, defines it this way: prayer that precedes God moving is contending prayer. To contend is to struggle, to stretch for something. This is proactive prayer, beseeching God to move, in which we cry out for God's mercy on behalf of ourselves, our communities, and nations. It's what we see in Ezra. It's what we see in Nehemiah. Because look, even at their best, even at Nehemiah's best, if you read the rest of the story, things don't actually go as well as probably they would have hoped. The rebuild of the wall was an accomplishment, but a much deeper, much fuller, much greater work still needed to be done. They still end up under Roman rule at the end of the story, in the end of the Old Testament, and when Jesus arrives. There's something beyond just what they can accomplish on their own. And for us, I think the same is true. Like we could meet all our volunteer needs this weekend and still be ineffective as a church. We could look at this and go like, hey, the population of volunteers, that's no guarantee of the power of God. So do we have a compelling vision of God, B, a collective effort from the people of God, but C, also a conviction about the Spirit of God? Let's be all in, all together, in prayer as well. So as I thought about my part in all this, as we close, I was thinking of the boy in the Gospels with his 5 loaves, his 2 fish, and the needs for Jesus to feed all these people, these 5,000 plus. It's like he can't do that on his own, but he stewards what he has, brings it to Jesus, and God does the work to meet the large need that he cannot meet. And I wonder, like, what am I bringing? What are you bringing? How are you engaged? It is playoff season for hockey fans, especially for me as a gross Edmonton Oilers fan, triggering the rest of you. Oh, come on. But also, I was thinking of years ago when my team had a great run and they didn't see their dreams come to pass. 2006, they make it all the way to Game 7, lose that very final game. And there's this interesting interview that one of the analysts has with one of these defeated Oilers after 2 months, body ravage, going through series after series, win after win, body check after body check, putting it all in there, and interviews in this moment of disappointment. And the response from this player was, and the question was like, how are you feeling? And the response was, you know what? We left it all out there. We left it all on the ice, and it was an honor. See, even if we are engaged, and maybe there are things that you've been engaged in, you're like, I've been praying, I've been serving, and I yet have not seen the thing I am hoping for. Maybe similar to Nehemiah, where this frustration comes because I'm doing my part, and even what I was hoping for hasn't yet come to pass. I wonder still if there's something to be had for us to think about. Am I still bringing my 5 loaves and 2 fish to Jesus anyways? Not holding anything back, leaving everything on the ice so that at the end of our lives we can go, you know what? I may not have seen everything I wanted to happen, but I left it all out there. Then it was an honor to serve my God. There is a next step, I think, for each of us, so I wonder what that is for you. So allow me to pray for you and see if God stirs you to something this week. Father, we see this story and we see what can happen by your power and by the response of your people. And we know the time in which we live is full of need because people need to know you and know you better. So right now in this room, would you prompt us, nudge us, highlight for us, bring something to mind where maybe we could engage just a little bit more? Maybe we're on a worship team and it's like our instrument is dialed in and we just know exactly how to use it, but maybe you're after more than just our music, you're after our heart. Maybe it's something to do with us serving, yes, but also engaging more deeply in prayer. Whatever it is, Lord, would we not ignore your request, your invitation for the opportunity that's before us? And for those of us who don't have a compelling vision of who you are, Lord, thank you You've brought them here today, and may there be some way in which you would make yourself known. Your Spirit guides us into truth. Would you guide us all into seeing your kingdom come and your will being done more fully on earth as it is in heaven. Amen.